Let's read through an email thread from today. I'm currently providing accessibility remediation services to clients. I don't, however, have a source for letters of conformance and would like to have real users with disabilities testing our work. Do you work with agencies who will conduct the audits, but you provide the user testing and conformance report? So this emailer is asking the right questions because the resulting documentation here, the conformance statement and documentation from user testing, are extremely compelling, and it's what any website owner would want. But there are multiple key concepts just within these initial 3 lines. So let's extract them now. First, he writes letters of conformance and conformance report. This is getting at a statement of conformance or a conformance statement. It's important to know that a statement of conformance is a construct of the W3C through their Web Accessibility Initiative, WAI. So, what that means is we are bound by their rules for issuing a conformance statement. So that's very important. And broadly, what needs to happen is for everything within scope, all content within scope needs to be fully conformant with a given version and conformance level of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So that's what needs to happen. There can be no instances of non-conformant content. So we're first restricted by that. And so that's going to come as the result of an audit. So once we have an audit where we have cleared the entire, all of the content, all of the pages, all of the screens within scope, then we can issue a conformance statement, but only then. And user testing is related to an audit, and there is some overlap, but these are two entirely distinct services. So user testing is going to be testing that is performed by an individual, by a professional with one or more disabilities, and they are going to relay their experience as they are going through, in this case, a website. With an audit, this is going to be a formal evaluation conducted by technical accessibility experts who are going to visually inspect the website, they're going to inspect the code, they are going to test with a screen reader, and they are going to keyboard test the website. So they are related, but they are distinct services. Both are extremely compelling. You would want to have an audit because this is where you're going to get all of the technical issues brought forward and reported on. And then user testing is optional, but highly recommended because this is what this is all for, right? We want to make sure that people with disabilities can access our website. And so user testing is going to practically relay whether one or more professionals can actually use the website and they're not encountering any accessibility issues. So documentation from user testing as well as a conformance statement, extremely compelling. It's definitely something that we would want, but it's important to not conflate these two. What happens, and even at some of the bigger accessibility companies, is they will conflate user testing and audits, and these are two distinct services. So that's very important to know. And then the question is, do you work with agencies who will conduct the audits, but you provide the user testing and conformance report? So we can't provide a conformance report if someone else conducts the audit because obviously we can't control that. We can only issue the documentation if we are going to go through the website ourselves. So in that case, we would need to audit to ensure that there are indeed no accessibility issues. But we can provide the user testing because the user testing is just that. It's just user testing. It's the report on whatever the user tester comes up with, whatever they come across, that's going to be what the report contains. So that's not any type of certification. That's not a conformance statement. That is merely relaying the experience of the user tester, and you can get documentation of that. So there's the difference there. Yes, we work with agencies, but if you conduct the audit, just know that we would also have to audit to issue a conformance statement. So that's what I have when I wrote back. I said, and this is just to quickly go through my response. Yes, we can provide the user testing service. We can't issue a conformance statement outright because we would need to audit ourselves to ensure full conformance. However, user testing would come with a document of attestation and a recording of the user testing session. We haven't worked with agencies yet in this capacity, but I don't anticipate any problems. One note here is you'd want to make sure the remediation is complete. Otherwise, some issues may return during the session. So what that's a very important point, because if you are going to go to the links to get user testing or to get an audit, and you're really doing it in with the objective of having this documentation to give to your client, you don't want to turn over documentation that has, let's say, several, or ideally you wouldn't want to send over documentation with any accessibility issues. So and you wouldn't get that with the conformance statement anyway. But what I'm getting at here is you want to make sure that everything is as solid as possible on your end, and that most there are maybe a scant few accessibility issues that you could fix really quickly and then turn that back and then get the documentation. So that's why I wrote here you'd want to make sure that remediation is indeed complete, unless you're really user testing just to find accessibility issues. But if that's the case, it's really an inefficient use of that service, because you could get an audit and uncover those issues. So the way that you prioritize and the order in which you approach these services definitely matters, because you can save money and also just not waste resources by going through the audit first and then making sure you find all the accessibility issues, and then going through user testing after you think all of the issues are fixed. And even before the audit, you may want to take care of accessibility issues so that there are less accessibility issues returned in the audit. So the way you approach these services definitely affects how efficient you are. You can probably save some money this way, and you can definitely save a lot of time. All right. So after my response, he wrote back, "Okay, I'm having a hard time figuring out how to price these services. Do you have a way of running an automated report to kind of gauge what the overall cost would be? I understand the value in the live audit with people with disabilities, but I have some clients that really need the help but don't necessarily have 10K plus budgets." All right, so let's stop there and just analyze what we have. So he's having a hard time figuring out how to price these services. There is no automated way to get an accurate price. You would get an estimate, but it's not going to be exact, because before we send out the final quote, we're going to need to scope this just to make sure that everything's in line. And so it's not going to be exact, but it's fairly easy to have a good idea of what the cost will be. And with accessible.org, usually for a website, the pages are going to be about $300. So it could be, but the range is typically $250 to $350. But if you just take $300 and multiply that by the number of pages, you'll have a fairly good idea of what the cost of the audit will be. So for example, a 10-page audit, about $3,000. And then he continues, "I understand the value in the live audit." So he says, "I understand the value in the live audit with people with disabilities." So it's not, again, the audit is separate. This is going to be, think of the audit as very technical, think of it as very sterile, and it is just, we're finding accessibility issues based on a given version and conformance level of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So we are evaluating and grading a website against the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And for any instances of nonconformance, those are going to be in the report. User testing is something else entirely. Yes, with user testing, we are going through, and you have a professional that is going through. Typically, it is an accessibility professional who is blind or visually impaired, and they are using screen reader assistive technology, and they are going to relay any accessibility issues that they come across, but this is not an audit. So understand the value in a live audit with people with disabilities, but I have some clients that really need the help, but don't necessarily have 10K plus budgets. So an audit and user testing shouldn't cost you $10,000. You're probably looking closer to 5,000 or less. And if you want to toggle the price down, then just reduce the scope. So then you would just focus on, let's say, 10 pages or 7 pages, and then you could bring the cost down into the lower four figures, so maybe $3,000 somewhere around there. But yeah, that's unless he's going ahead and factoring in his remediation service, it wouldn't reach that level just for an audit and user testing unless it's a very complex website or we have a lot of pages in scope. So then he continues with an example site. And he says, my thoughts were we could settle on, let's say, 5 pages to audit, knowing that most of the pages of the site are the same or at least have the same features. Yeah, I think that's completely reasonable. 5 pages is usually cutting it on the short end. So maybe more like 7 or 8, because that's going to include some of those other primary flows. But I think that's on the right track. Is just if budget is a concern and you still want the conformance statement, then just take the scope down to the most critical pages and have those be in the scope. But I do think for most websites, and especially for, let's say, an e-commerce website, or maybe another type of professional website, 5 pages is usually on the lighter side. So I'd want to bump that up to two to three more pages or screens, and then have that be the scope of the audit. But yes, keeping it to the very core, and then you can take those audit results and apply those to other pages and screens. Obviously, when you're cutting the pages down, you sacrifice to some degree on knowing unique accessibility issues that may come up otherwise because of unique content or different page layouts or other dynamic elements. But you're going to have a really good feel for the accessibility issues that reside on the website. So he continues, let's see, my thoughts where we could settle on, let's say, 5 pages. And then he continues, not sure how that works with letters of conformity, though. So all that happens is we adjust the scope. And then he continues, would a VPAT be better for clients with lesser budgets? Sorry for my ignorance with this. First of all, this is no problem. I don't mind answering these questions because if you haven't been in accessibility, there's so much jargon, there are so many terms, and so many people use them incorrectly, and it can get very confusing. Even if you've just looked into this for, let's say, a few hours, you have to really unpack everything. So definitely, this person is on the right track, and he writes, would a VPAT be better for clients? No, because with VPATs, they're not really for websites. Now they can be. They can include websites. They can be a website if, let's say, the website is a web app or it's a platform. If it's a product or a service, that's what VPATs were intended for. So voluntary product accessibility template. Every now and then I hear someone tell me that they want a VPAT, and obviously the ACR is in this conversation, right? So a VPAT is only the template, and then the ACR is the completed VPAT. Once you have all of the information filled out in the VPAT, then that converts to an ACR, or accessibility conformance report. The terms are used interchangeably. That's in part why this can get so confusing. But to keep this straight, the VPAT, would it be better for clients with lesser budgets? No, the VPAT's actually going to cost more, because then you have the audit that's necessary to have all of the accessibility information to populate and complete the VPAT. And you've got to carry that over to the VPAT, fill it in. And so that's an additional service cost. And so with accessible.org, typically that's going to cost $550 to have the VPAT filled out to create the ACR. And that's in addition to the audit, which is necessary to find all the accessibility issues to fill in the VPAT. So know that, that's, first of all, that it's probably not even applicable if you're looking at most websites and you're just concerned with the website accessibility. For documentation, I wouldn't even worry about the VPAT. The VPAT, by the way, it stands for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. Note the key word, product. The website is not usually going to be considered a product. It might be a part of a product. Let's say you have documentation on the website, then that could implicate the website. But in most cases, a VPAT will not be applicable to a website. And then continuing on, I've been remediating sites for a long time, but was shocked when I saw how expensive actual remediation with conformance letters was. So I don't know how much was shocking, but yeah, remediation, it just costs a lot because you have to have a developer who is not only first of all skilled in development, but then can also is aware of accessibility and how to remediate for accessibility. And then it just takes a while for them to go through this website, and it's just an extended process. Um, it's um, it's one that's somewhat, it's not, I wouldn't call, I was about to call it slow. It's not necessarily slow. It just, some of this takes a while to get through. And so yes, it can be, it can definitely get expensive, but it just depends, what do you think shocking is. And so for context, with accessible.org, it's typically 350 to 550 per page for remediation. But yeah, I mean, it just gets more expensive because this is actual work that can be done. It's not something you can automate. It's just something you have to take your time, and you need to have someone who is able to do this competently. And then he continues, and we normally worked with another partner, and they named the partner, and I've redacted that, along with the example site, and clients who had already contacted them as opposed to coming to us first. Oh yeah. So if you go to some of these digital accessibility companies, the cost of the project is going to be, it can be extremely high. So just, when you go through these digital accessibility companies, some of them are charging a lot. Like when I say a lot, like I mean a lot more than I charge. And like they'll inflate the prices of everything. They'll try to sell scans that aren't necessary. So it's always good to just get quotes, because some of the bigger digital accessibility companies charge um, exceedingly high amounts, and I mean just really over the top amounts. So we've typically just been providing the technical service as opposed to the entire process. Yeah, so I mean, it's good to be involved, especially if you have the ability to remediate websites. That's a huge plus, right? That's something that's very desirable in the market. It is very much needed, and I think this person's asking the right questions, and just working through this and help. Once you get a better feel for this and understand it better, you'll understand what all the terms mean, how everything fits together, the chronological ordering of the services, what works best for clients. And so, yeah, you can really bring down the cost by offering this directly and not going through a digital accessibility company. So that's my response to this. To end, I have this last part where I actually answer the email. So my reply to his response. And so let me just read through this and make sure I covered everything. So yes, no automated way to accurately price and audit. There are calculators out there. You can do the simple math with accessible.org's 250 to 350 range. But just know that it can't be like a final quote. It can't be. I don't know if I emphasized the T there. And audit and user testing. So I talked about how the audit and user testing are two different services. A core set of pages is the best way, focusing on a core set of pages being the best way to bring down the cost of an audit. And this is important, a conformance statement doesn't have to be for an entire website. And in fact, it won't be in most cases because websites are just too expansive. So it will usually be for a core set of pages and or screens anyway. So it's okay to focus just on a core set of pages. That's perfectly fine. Um, and then I write about the VPATs being for products and services. And that's something that I have noticed it keeps coming up. And I think even some digital accessibility companies, they get, they're not sure how to, they're not sure how that works. And VPATs just aren't for websites. They can be. The website can be a part of it. If the website is considered part of the product or service, or it is the product or service, then yes, it could potentially call for a VPAT slash ACR, but VPATs are for products. Think of VPATs for software. Think of VPATs for apps, but not VPATs for websites. And then I talk more about the VPATs and the ACR. I talk about conformance statements being a construct of the W3C. And then certification doesn't necessarily have to come from the remediation service. So yeah, like this is one other part. If you're looking for documentation, and this could be a conformance statement and or provider certification, which we offer both, and they both speak to the same thing, that the digital asset is accessible and WCAG conformant. But if we audit your website and there are zero accessibility issues, we'll issue a conformance statement slash certification. So just know that it doesn't have to be directly from remediation. And in fact, it won't be with us, because we have to make sure on our end that we are issuing correct documentation. So we can't just take someone's word for it, as credible as they may be. We have to do that in-house. That has to come from us as a result of our auditors looking through and making sure that there are zero accessibility issues. And so, yeah, that's the basis of my response. But this person asked some really good questions, and we worked through several key concepts that come up with digital accessibility and documentation. So now, working through those, you have a better feel for what these different terms mean and how they interact and relate to one another. So we've gone through this. I will go ahead and link to resources on accessible.org in the description. And then I will also link to two courses that are found on adacompliance.net, one pertaining to starting a business in digital accessibility, and then the other for digital agencies who are working not in accessibility, but just working on, let's say, marketing or web design or web development or whatever it is, for agencies who are trying to work through ADA compliance themselves, not just on their digital assets, but also helping clients with work through ADA compliance and accessibility. I have a course on that as well, and I will link to that in the description.